Hey folks, if you were following the gaming scene in 2016, I can only imagine you've heard about Superhot Team's Superhot, an FPS where time only moved when you did. The, most innovative shooter people had played in years. Mimetic nonsense aside, I'd actually missed the bus on this one, but also dodged spoilers, so I figured I'd finally get around to it. And well, it was a great time. Short, sure, but quite solid. And then I discovered something. 4 years later, there'd been a sequel, Mind Control Delete. Unlike its predecessor, I hadn't really heard much about this, despite this entry promising to change things up a bit. And well, it did, to the point that I felt compelled to make this video. But was it because the gameplay was superb, or was it not all that hot? I'm your host Darlian, let's find out together. Superhot. Whether it was from a friend or a shady forum, countless people had managed to get their hands on a cracked version of the game. An addictive title which seemed to omit plot in favor of throwing players into a series of disjointed combat arenas. But there was something else beneath the surface, wasn't there? The rabbit hole went deep, and yet there were those who sought out its secrets all the same, who saw the point of no return and ignored it despite every warning sign, even those which lay in the real world. And in Mind Control Delete, you follow one such individual, but not someone pursuing the path. Rather, you play as someone who'd come out the other side, changed. Which sounds interesting at a glance, but how well was it executed? Undoubtedly, veterans of the series are likely to look fondly on how the narrative played out in its predecessor, as it alternated between the action-oriented stages, small story-focused segments which progressed the narrative, and the mystery at the core of Superhot. And even then, that hardly encompassed the methodology of the initial title. See, if one was so inclined, they could delve for more, pushing the figurative and literal boundaries of its stages, all in pursuit of mysterious terminals. While the elements contained within each individual terminal were minimal, they effectively served as a bread trail of sorts, one that highlights the more horrific elements of the story, and culminated in a final secret that recontextualized an earlier segment. What's more, even if you weren't story-focused, it was still a neat bit of side content to tackle with, given that searching for these terminals, as well as the act of reaching them, often provided novel bits of puzzle platforming. I say all this because I was far less keen on how Mind Control Delete tackles its narrative elements. While its brief introduction certainly piqued my interest, its delivery past that point left a lot to be desired, given that beyond a few brief scenes, I had little to sift through. For instance, if I progressed down one of the map paths, I might be able to earn a story node, but those tended to be lackluster. Story nodes, for instance, you can earn by clearing certain stages, but they tend to be comprised of a disjointed sentence, and while the terminals do exist here, they're substantially less interesting content-wise as well as access-wise. What I mean by this is that their placement tends to be much more blatant and generally locked behind a contextual action, which I suppose makes sense given each stage is a lot more limited in nature, given they're less of a set piece and more arenas. Arenas you'll be seeing a lot of. Speaking of which, as far as the most basic of premises, Mind Control Delete retains the core concept of the series, being an FPS where time only moves when you do. Relatively. If you're gonna get really technical, it's more like it moves at a crawl while you're standing still. And yes, looking around does count as movement, though to a much lesser degree than taking a step forward or firing a weapon. In either case, this mechanic does lend itself to some fairly compelling combat situations when you consider the constant influx of enemies from all sides in tandem with the relative fragility of the protagonist, namely them dying in 3 hits by default. Having to figure out where to position yourself in order to avoid the combination of incoming bullets and melee-wielding mooks, all while needing to figure out who's the biggest priority to kill, while juggling limited ammo and fragile weapons, can be truly harrowing. Especially since time speeds up with every swing of the sword or bullet fired. Still, even with those overwhelming odds, there's a certain sense of fairness to it all, especially since the game is careful to avoid spawning enemies adjacent to you. There's just one small problem with it all. An issue I'd already alluded to earlier. It's a highly iterative experience to the point that even the relatively small arenas manage to overstay their welcome. Part of the problem is that they simply lack the more interesting quirks of its predecessor. See, while the initial stages of the first Superhot were fairly straightforward, it wasn't long before it began to provide increasingly interesting and altogether different scenarios, with a combination of enemy arrangements and layouts conspiring to make your life hell and forcing you to adapt. On the other hand, the arenas in Mind Control Delete feel substantially simpler, both in regards to their design, but also due to the way its opposition isn't tactically placed, but rather spawned as needed. Like sure, Mind Control Delete does gradually start to introduce different kinds of enemies, such as these marble mooks over here that are only vulnerable in one spot, or these spiky jerks who happen to explode into bullets when they die. There's also dudes toting around railguns, which can nice scan hit you if you're not in cover, but if you have any intention of just trying to binge levels, it gets pretty tedious early on. And that's because of how you're introduced to its stages. See, in order to progress through Mind Control Delete, you're asked to tackle the various nodes in order to progress through each of the game's layers. Here's the thing though, each node is essentially just a random handful of the aforementioned levels, and given that it'll ask you to clear a good handful of them per node, it's not long until you're beginning to see them loop over and over again. I will give the game some credit that later on it will somewhat change up layouts by adding little glitched walls that force you to traverse them differently, but it's still very much an iterative process. And before you go, wait, it's a roguelite, right? Surely there's something compelling in the player's kit to help break up the tedium. And to that I say, sort of. As you progress through a node, you'll occasionally be offered a random perk. These can range from more ammo in the guns you find, greatly reduced cooldown periods between shots, better range on melee attacks, or even causing mundane objects to explode when thrown. Which sounds great until you realize that describes a good chunk of the initial ability pool. It's a very shallow selection to choose from at first, and while you can clear more optional nodes in order to broaden it, it advances at a lethargic pace to the point that it'll take a considerable amount of time to expand it to a meaningful degree and to unlock some of the funnier combinations. And even the game's piercing core system can't quite save it. See, cores imbue the player with a specific perk. For instance, the default more core boosts your max health. Without it, you die in 2 hits. That said, you do gain the ability to unlock more cores as you progress, each of which have their own quirks. The charge core, for instance, boosts your unarmed damage and provides you a powerful gap closer that allows you to dodge bullets and delete a nearby enemy. Another one is the Hot Switch core, which veterans of the first game may recognize as it grants you the ability to take over the body of an enemy in view and brain burst your old bod on the way out. Sure, they're on a cooldown, but these abilities can provide solid alternatives in how to tackle a given situation and to potentially bail you out of a situation where you might otherwise be forced to take damage. They also have the secondary effect of introducing a few perks into the pool relative to their effect while equipped. The more core technically has this, but it just adds more health, whereas the charge core provides cooldown reduction on kill and can even chain strikes later on. Still, while this did help to inject a bit more life into the game whenever these were earned, they can only do so much when you're asked to repeatedly clear the same stages endlessly with a relatively small arsenal. Which, yeah, the game did introduce a new weapon in the form of the railgun that translates to a whopping 4 guns. That's not to say there hasn't been some neat additions, like being able to deflect bullets into someone with a well-timed melee, or pointy ranged weapons letting you just kill people, but yeah, this was an experience. I will give it credit on the aesthetic side of things though, because it's less blindingly white than its predecessor. Like, it's still very much an environment made of sterile white concrete, with the occasional black throwable object and a whole lot of red thugs, but I didn't find myself stumbling into vast vistas which seared my retinas, a common occurrence during my out-of-bounds secret hunting in the first game. Instead, the only visual wonkiness I encountered was the intentional and very trippy sequences that start to crop up late game, which made for some very interesting situations to adapt to, since it entirely fucks with my depth perception. As for the music side of things, well, I literally can't say anything bad about it. There's some tracks in there that can do an absolutely stellar job of pumping up for the fights at hand, while others serve to set ambience for the sparse non-combat scenes. I literally cannot think of a single track I disliked in this game, which is saying something, to the point that I listened through the OST even after putting down Mind Control Delete. And as for a general sound design note, I actually really appreciate the sound of the gunshots because they did a great job of letting you know when someone had actually fired off a shot in your direction and the relative location. But yeah, Mind Control Delete is sort of interesting because if it wasn't for me writing this review, I very likely would have set this game aside. After the tour de force that was the first Superhot, I wasn't sure what to expect, but it wasn't this. That's not to say I uniformly dislike it. I think parts of it are certainly interesting, but the way the stages play out feels like a snapshot of its predecessor's Endless Mode, with rogue perks tossed into the mix. I'll wholly admit that I found myself struggling against a sense of exhaustion, which continued to build up as I piled through the various nodes on each of the game's layers. Like, sure, the introduction of new cores and perks helped, as did the slight variety in its enemy pool, but the nature of Mind Control Delete quickly extinguished whatever novelty those had, and this is coming from someone that plays a lot of roguelites, I might add. Like, when I initially tackled this game, I had no intention of reviewing this title. It was just meant as something to poke at when I was relaxing. After all, everyone and their dog had heard of the first game, right? But then I reached Mind Control Delete, and there was just something so wearying about it that I felt a compulsion to talk about my experience. And I should note that the game entirely acknowledges this repetitive tedium in a story sequence, I might add, in a couple of them. That's not to say there aren't things that are interesting in Mind Control Delete. The later game, for instance, adds unkillable mini-bosses, which add a tactical element to the proceeding, since you need to adjust your strategies to take into account their obnoxiously powerful abilities, all while still trying to keep up a nice pace of killing red mooks without getting overwhelmed by their attacks. Admittedly, at that juncture, you should have a somewhat decent pool of perks and cores, but it can still be rough. That's the thing though, this doesn't save it. Even with all of that, this still boiled down to a fumble for me. Like, again, it's not that bad at the tail end of the experience, but this falls into a trap of, if you just play it a bit longer, things get good. And that's part of why this makes it so hard for me to just recommend it uniformly, other than to fans of the original game. And if they were fond of the more puzzle-oriented elements that incorporated, it's entirely possible they're going to walk away from this as disappointed as I was. So yeah, I guess I'll go round out this review with, go check out the original Superhot. It's genuinely quite rad, and if you're absolutely starved for more, Mind Control Delete does exist. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you have something to say, leave a comment, and if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews and interviews, hit subscribe and the bell. For a link to my Discord, the Crit Hit Cauldron, check the description, and check out my Patreon to see reviews early and support the channel, like Shrimp Mania did, Green Witch Babby, and Andy Noted. Also, I have a merch house with neat swag like Crit Hit coffee mugs and shirts. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.